you and welcome to Bourbon and BS, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of spirits, one shot at a time. I'm Mike Fody, founder and director of the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, where our goal is to help you master spirits to guide your choices for the next bottle you want to pick. Today we're uncorking the secrets behind whiskey labels. So whether you're a seasoned connoisseur or just starting your whiskey journal, understanding what's on the label is essential. It's essential for you to pick your next spirit. Decoding whiskey labels will help you decide if a bottle's for you, and the information is required by the TTB. That's the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. Some of the information's required, some isn't, and some goes on there just for the marketing purposes of the business that's producing the spirit. So the label gives you an idea about the distillery, the brand, and the people that's producing it. From iconic labels like Jack Daniel's to craft distilleries like the Buffalo Distilling Company, each label provides critical information about the product and what to expect when you take your first sip. Many labels carry the rich history associated with the product and its makers. It's said of packaging that you can grab a consumer's attention in 10 seconds or less. If you don't grab their attention, you probably never will. If you've ever walked into a big retail store like we have them in Buffalo, where they've got literally probably over 1,000 bottles of bourbon, how do you pick something? Unless you go in there with a specific spirit in mind, you're probably just going to pick the same thing that you always get. Again, a lot of these places do tastings, and if you can get onto their calendar so they email you or message you to indicate when their next tasting is, that's a great way to not only taste the spirit, but to read the label and start understanding what's in that label that can help you pick your next bottle. So here's why names matter. It gives you an idea of the brand story. Whiskey's allure lies in its rich history and craftsmanship. Consumers connect with the story behind a brand, the distillery's heritage, and the people who create it, and the passion involved. Some of my favorite scotches come from distilleries that struck me because of the family story and the tradition associated with them. For example, the Springbank Distilling Company in Campbelltown, Scotland, continues to be owned and operated by the descendants of the original founder. The distillery operates much like it did 200 years ago, sticking very close to tradition. And it was one of the first schools I ever went to, and it was just an absolute ball. The people were fun. The folks that are the descendants of the original owners were a ball. The Buffalo Distilling Company has a unique and rich history dating back to 1883, when Gustav Fleischmann of the famous Fleischmann yeast started the company up. It ended right before Prohibition because of all the legal issues associated with Prohibition. But today it was reinvigorated, and it is a farm distillery licensed company in Buffalo, New York. What that means is that at least 75% of its ingredients have to come from local farms and businesses. So it makes it a special part of the region, giving it a very unique story that they share, because in the Buffalo market, people really enjoy supporting local companies that originated here. Additionally, it operates in the old Dutchman and Sons carriage factory built in 1890. It has a unique connection to Buffalo's history, not only from the distillery, but from the old Dutchman's carriage factory. And the name One Foot Cock is fun, and it tells a story about the people who make it and who make the whiskey there. So what happens is a glass of whiskey becomes more than a drink. It becomes a tangible link to the past or to the people that are there continuing the traditions of a bygone era. Passion, good whiskey is born from passion, just like the successful brands. Passionate leaders create movements, not just products. So consumers can taste the difference when a brand is crafted with genuine love and enthusiasm versus just as a part of a 50,000 gallon mass production. It also gives the label also gives identity. In a very crowded market, whiskey standouts are very hard to pick out. You go into, like I said, one of these very large retail outlets in New York State. How do you pick something out? Names like One Foot Cock or Bourbon and BS, they're fun, they're even risque, but they tell you something about the brand and the people that are producing it. They draw you in and make you want to learn more. So, whether through a renowned brand name or a whiskey flavor profile associated with a specific distillery, the identity matters. Brand names set a brand apart and help consumers recognize it and trust it and want to go back and buy it. So, what else comes on a whiskey label other than this identity? Well, one of the things that's really important is to help you decipher sort of the alphabet soup. For instance, is it a bourbon? Is it a rye? Is it a Scotch, Irish? Whiskey comes in various classes and types, as we've discussed. But how do you figure that out by just looking at a label? Now, today I'm going to focus on the labels of the Buffalo Distilling Company, but the elements apply to all whiskeys sold in the United States. The labels identify the similarities while highlighting the unique characteristics of each product. So, beyond what type of whiskey it is, whether it's a bourbon or a Scotch or an Irish whiskey, the ABV, the proof is in the pudding or in the bottle, as they would say. Alcohol by volume or proof affects the aroma, flavor, mouth feel, and even aging. The ABV is a key label element important for selecting between whiskeys. Why? The higher the ABV, a lot of times it's produced in a column still instead of a pot still, so you might not have all the flavor components in it that you would have if it was produced in a pot still. That makes a big difference to people. The ABV gives you an idea of why some whiskeys pack a punch while other ones are more mellow. I actually am not a big fan, as I might have mentioned before, of really high ABV whiskeys. Now, you can take away some of the burn by adding water, but that's not going to bring in more congeners. It's not going to give the whiskey a more complex character. It does also help you with important terms such as finishing, bottled in bond, cask strength, and small batch. Some of the terms tell you about the product, while others are just marketing glitz to draw you in, but they have no true meaning. The taste, aroma, and mouthfeel of a product are shaped by the cask entry ABV and the bottle proof. They play such a huge role in the final product that you're getting from that producer. So net contents has to be listed on the label. Why? Because size matters. Have you ever wondered why whiskey bottles come in different sizes? There are typically two standard volumes, the 750 ml and the 375 ml. And they impact production, they impact the equipment that has to be used, and the costs, including taxes, because alcohol is taxed by the concentration or the amount of alcohol in a bottle. Other important information that isn't TTB required is some of the marketing and consumer information, logos, unique attributes of the brand, like for instance Mafia brand. That's something that's big in Buffalo and might help with sales. Spatial designations for part of the proceeds. So the designation on one of the products is Robbie's Bass Buzz, which is from the Buffalo Distilling Company, the band Goo Goo Dolls. They donate a percentage of the proceeds from the sale of that specific whiskey to the Music as Art Foundation. And then scan codes are another thing that are included on the bottle's label. Non-distiller produced. It's common practice to purchase and repack spirits for sale. Ethically, a distilling business should indicate whether it's produced in that specific region or locality, or if it's produced somewhere else and they just buy it and label it and sell it, but under their own name. So a lot of distilleries do that, especially craft distilleries when they're starting up. They may buy bourbon or vodka from MGP in Indiana. They bottle it and they have them label it there, and they just sell it at their own distillery or in the local market. Why? Because when you start a craft distillery, especially if you're going to be selling whiskey and producing whiskey, it's going to take you at least 2 years to have a straight bourbon whiskey available. So you can start producing it, but you're not going to be able to sell it until at least 2 years later. And maybe 2 years later, it's not got the profile that you want. So it could take even longer than just 2 years. Another thing that's required to be on the label is if it's flavored or infused. That's becoming a really increased practice. It's a growing practice. But once it occurs, if it's in a bourbon, it's really literally no longer legally bourbon. So bourbon has to be produced, as the TTB stipulates, in a new charred white oak barrel. If you take that bourbon then and put it in a port barrel, for instance, for 6 months, it legally is no longer bourbon. Now that's a description that some people don't really care about, but from a legal perspective, that does define what the product is. As well as another thing is secondary maturation or finishing. That's a rapidly growing trend that distillers and sellers are using to develop unique products. Anytime a bourbon is aged, as I mentioned, in a cask other than that new make white oak cask, it no longer is a bourbon. And the label has to stipulate that. So when you're looking at the label, if you're looking for a straight bourbon whiskey and you don't want all those extra finishes like honey or maple or port or Chardonnay, look at the label. It'll tell you what's in there. Now, I'm not saying that that's not good. I'm saying that if that's what you want, great. If it's not, be sure to take a look at the label. Another process related to maturation is the placing of staves or wood chips from a cask that once held other spirits. That's another thing that producers can do to change what's in the cask. And then there's some other legal terms like bottled and bond. This law set forth legal standards so consumers knew exactly what they were getting. And the main standards are that it has to be made at one distillery. That's to guarantee that the distillery that sold it actually made it. It has to be made in one distillery season, and that's to guarantee the age of the product in the bottle. Now note, there are 2 distillery seasons in the United States, January to June and July to December. So that has to be stipulated to the government. It has to be bottled at exactly 50% ABV or 100 proof. That's to ensure that the product was not watered down and no other chemicals were added to it. Back around Prohibition and times before Prohibition, people used to add all kinds of stuff to the whiskey to extend the volume. So if they had a 53-gallon cask and they put it into a bigger container and added water or turpentine or whatever they used to add, they could change that into 75 gallons and sell it for a lot more. They'd make a lot more money. And it has to be aged at least 4 years in a government bonded warehouse. Another terminology that you'll see quite frequently with American whiskeys, particularly bourbon, is sweet mash or sour mash. What's the difference? During distillation, the solids that are left at the bottom of a column still have a very high acid concentration and are mixed with the next cooking and fermentation batches. Why? Well, they accidentally figured out that if you threw the sour mash from a previous batch into the cooking or fermentation tank, it increased the acidity of the fermenting product. And what that did was it killed or prevented the growth of bacteria that would sometimes cause batches to go bad, to sour. Once a batch goes sour, it is not usable. You can't recover it. You just have to throw it away. And that was a very expensive proposition for people, especially back in the 1800s and 1900s. So they sort of stumbled over this idea of sweet mash. Now, today, that issue is not an issue because there are all kinds of cleaning compounds and they use stainless steel and other types of materials to produce the whiskey in, so that if you clean the apparatus, the distillation apparatus or the fermentation apparatus properly, the chance of getting bacteria in it are extremely small. So, for instance, the Wilderness Trail Distillery, which uses a sweet mash process, is still a very large distillery, but they do not use sour mash. The next item that can be and should be included on the cask label is the barrel strength. The contents of one cask are used to fill bottles without proofing down if you have a barrel strength whiskey or a cask strength whiskey. Thus, the ABV in the bottle is identical to the ABV in the cask. That's a common practice now. Because it does have a higher ABV, it's taxed at a higher level, and the producers charge a higher amount. A similar terminology or term is called single barrel, and there's no legal definition of what a single barrel is. The name implies that all the bourbon in the bottle came from one barrel, so it should be true because the law requires any label information to be accurate. But that's not always necessary if you get a producer that's just trying to make some quick money. Small batch. Again, there's no legal definition for this term. Some distillers indicate the number of barrels used to make a batch to bottle, but in reality, it doesn't tell you anything about the product. Now, Tennessee whiskey, on the other hand, has something called the Lincoln County process, and that's a filtration process unique to Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee whiskey doesn't have a federal definition. It's a state definition, but the product, if it has been through the Lincoln County process, that's a filtration process, and you have to filter the bourbon through a bed of charcoal made from maple wood. Now, Tennessee whiskey is bourbon that's filtered through maple wood, but not all bourbon is Tennessee whiskey because it's not filtered through maple wood. Another filtration process that you can see on labels is called chilled filtration. And what is that? Well, if you take some whiskeys that have not been chilled filtered and you add ice or you chill them, what happens is certain compounds, particularly fats, lipid molecules, they precipitate and it makes the whiskey look cloudy. Some consumers don't like that. And so what the producers do is they chill the whiskey down to a low temperature, typically around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and they filter it through a paper filter. And what that does is it removes those lipid compounds that will precipitate or form little balls in the whiskey that causes that cloudiness. So once you've done that, it won't become cloudy when it becomes chilled. The problem with that is by removing certain chemicals, you do change the whiskey. And so aficionados don't like chill-filtered whiskeys, chill-filtered scotches, whether it's scotch or bourbon. They just don't, they feel like it changes the profile of the product too much. And so a lot of people do not like chill-filtered whiskeys. Then the TTB does not have a definition for craft distillery. We all talk about it, and I even say I like craft distilleries because they can be more creative. There's no real expectation for their brands as much as there is for a big boy like a Woodford Reserve or a Jack Daniels. But there's no legal definition. Craft distilleries are generally considered to be small scale, independent producers that focus on quality and artisanal production. Farm distillers typically require the use of 75% or more sourced materials to come from the specific state in which they are located. And that's why I mentioned the Buffalo Distilling Company is a farm distillery licensed producer. And so actually about 100% of their sourced materials come from local sources in New York State. Optional label information include age statements. Age statements may or may not be required depending on the country's or the state's regulations. For instance, one thing that's pretty consistent is age statement must reflect the youngest whiskey to make the final product. So every whiskey whether you knew it or not, is a blend, typically a blend of at least 2 or 3 barrels, but can be blends of up to thousands of barrels, hundreds of barrels. In doing that, if you put an age statement on the label, the youngest whiskey that was included in that blend is the age of the whiskey. So let's say you made something that had a 5-year in it, a 10-year, and a 15-year. The producer cannot label it as 10 or 15 year. They have to label it as 5-year old whiskey because that's the youngest whiskey that was used to make the final product. Dietary information is sometimes included. Most of the time you don't see it. People ask if whiskey is gluten-free. It is. Distinctive or fanciful names. They're mandatory for specialty products, like if it's a honey infused or something like that. Gluten statements, if it's relevant. I've never seen a gluten statement on a whiskey bottle. The TTB does require any food allergens to be indicated on the label. I don't really have never seen that before. Nutrient content statements, serving facts, alcohol facts, and sugar content. Of course, the ABV has to be listed, but I've never seen any of these other features on labels. Production claims, organic. You know what? What makes a whiskey organic? But some people do claim that theirs is organic. Maybe the grain. I'm not sure about that. Personalized labels are cool. The Golden Grain whiskey is at the Buffalo Distilling Company is a throwback label back to a picture from the 1880s. So that makes it cool and it makes it very brand recognizable. There is artistic freedom. Craft and farm distilleries often have more creative freedom in label design compared to larger producers because nobody has a expectation for their product. For instance, the brand from the Buffalo Distilling Company is called One Foot Cock, and it's a rooster standing on one leg. Those things tell a unique story about the distillery, enhance the brand identity, and that is a way to, hopefully increase sales. So that's my story about whiskey labels. You can find more if you're really interested in the beverage alcohol manual from the TTB regulations. At some point in time, it gets to be too much. Some producers love to put their mash bill on. Some don't. Some will list yeasts that they use. Some feel that that's proprietary. So a lot of times the information that's on a label is restricted by the producer if it's not required by the TTB because they feel like it's proprietary, and if they provide that information, somebody might be able to recreate their product. I do want to mention a few words about the Don't Worry Whiskey Club that the Buffalo Distilling Company has. It's a fun club. I actually typically present some educational component for the club. It meets every other month on a Tuesday evening, and so you can find information about the club on the Buffalo Distilling Company's website. Every meeting you get a free cocktail. They provide dinner, the educational component. The last time we had it in December, we actually were able to fill our own cask strength bottle of whiskey. We put up a cask of whiskey about 5 years ago, and they checked it out, they opened it up, and we hand pumped filled bottles full of the Golden Grain whiskey. We hand labeled it, hand corked it, hand labeled it, and then wax dipped it, and it was a lot of fun. So it's something to consider if you're in an area where there's a whiskey club and you can join something like that. I encourage you to do it because those are the places where you'll pick up a lot more information from other people about how the vocabulary they used, how they talk about the whiskey, the experiences, the aromas. And to me, there's nothing that smells better than going into a distillery if you have one in the area and smelling those grains fermenting. It's an amazing place to go and an amazing experience. Ours is run right out of the distillery, so that makes it a really unique whiskey club. So now I want to change gears and talk a little bit about the dram that changed everything for me. It is strange that I can pinpoint the exact location and almost moment my whiskey journey began. I was on the Isle of Skye in Portree, Scotland at the Cullen Hills Hotel with my daughter. We were on a trip, just traveling around Scotland, with a group of people that had kids as well. And the kids on the trip were off learning about bagpipes and Highland dancing, while the adults were given the opportunity and sort of herded into a whiskey tasting. Up to that date, I barely drank, and when I did, it was usually a red wine, something like a Chianti. Growing up on a Concord grape farm where my father made what could only be described as shitty Dago red wine, I learned early to be accepting of anything that called itself wine, red or white or whatever. So when in Rome, I figured, why not try whiskey? The first two samples were young Islay scotches that nearly made me vomit. To my palate, it tasted like someone had actually poured some ethanol in an ashtray, gave it a good swirl, and invited me to taste and swallow it. I quietly attempted to make my escape after trying these two samples until the whiskey expert intercepted me and insisted I try one more. He handed me a glass filled with a reddish-brown liquid. Before it got anywhere near my mouth, I gave it a cautious sniff. Now, I've put many things in my mouth, some of them I'm not proud of, but another glass of liquid cigarette ash was not going to be one of them. Then, wham, the aroma hit me. It was intriguing, pleasant, familiar in a way that I couldn't quite name. So I took a sip. As the liquid coated my mouth, the experience was shockingly enjoyable, almost fruity. There was a burn, yes, but it wasn't real harsh. More like a warm, comforting glow that flowed and followed the whiskey down my throat. I immediately pictured myself in front of my fireplace back home, savoring a dram as the day wound down. That single pour, and it ended up being a single malt scotch called Glendronach, changed my life in a way I never could have imagined. It opened a door to exploration, community, and shared experiences with like-minded people. Upon returning to Buffalo, I marched into the nearest liquor store, determined to recreate that magical moment that I had experienced in Scotland. The clerk there recommended a bottle, single malt, he swore was great. I mean, what the hell did I know about picking out a single malt scotch? They didn't have Glendronach, but this guy seemed confident, and the bottle cost a whopping $80 in 2013. So it had to be good, right? More money, better product. Wrong. I got home, cracked it open, and was immediately assaulted by the same god-awful burnt ash aroma that had nearly made me puke in Scotland. My stomach turned, my eyes watered, my dreams of my fireplace sipping evaporated instantly. All right, I thought, there's more to this than I realized. 3 things became imminently clear. I needed to learn a hell of a lot more before I bought another bottle of whiskey, particularly when it cost over $50. I wanted to share what I learned with others so they did not make the same mistakes that I did, and I needed to find someone to regift this crap to that would actually appreciate and enjoy it. Fortunately, I knew a guy who would literally drink urine if it contained ethanol. I handed him the bottle, and he thought I was the most generous man alive. Meanwhile, I didn't have to pour $80 down the drain. It was a win-win from my perspective. But the path forward, in that moment, the contrast between the transcendent Glendronach and the ashtray in a bottle I brought back home, lit a fire in me. I wanted to understand why whiskey could be so wildly different. I wanted to learn, explore, taste, compare, and eventually share that knowledge with others so they didn't make the same mistake that I did. That curiosity, frustration, and eventual passion became the foundation for what would grow into the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, a place dedicated to help people discover their own Glendronach moment without the ashtray detours. But I had no idea on what to do. I figured I could buy books, and I checked Google and tried to figure out what were good books on whiskey to help me learn about it, and magazines as well. And one of them I stumbled over was the Whiskey Advocate, and so I thought, well, I'll subscribe to this. The one article in the Whiskey Advocate that was very helpful to me was a description of various whiskey schools around the world. And in particular, they indicated that the Springbank Whiskey School was the PhD of all whiskey schools available currently at the time. So there's a place on the Kintry Peninsula in western Scotland that changed the course of my whiskey life. And if someone had told me ahead of time that I would be willing to fork over $2,500 plus flights, meals, car rental, lodging, and dog sitting fees just for the privilege of working in a distillery for a week, I would have told them that they were full of crap. No hesitation. But that's exactly what I did, and I don't regret a penny of the money that I spent. Less than a year after that life-altering dram of Glendronach, I was back in Scotland. I read a few books by then, but reading about whiskey production and actually understanding it are two very different things. Books don't make you sweat. Books don't make your back ache. Books don't make you question your life choices at 6 a.m. In-person training does, and it's worth every damn dollar of it. So there I was in Campbelltown, a town that once roared with more than 30 distilleries and now hangs on with 3. Springbank, Glen Scotia, and Glengyle. And Springbank, stubborn, independent, old-school Springbank, it's where I attended my first whiskey school. That week lit the fuse for everything I've done since. I've done tastings, education, teaching, and eventually building a career around whiskey from grain to glass. It's a retirement career. It's something I do for fun, to share what I've learned with others. But to understand why Springbank hit me so deeply, you have to understand the distillery itself, its lineage, its refusal to modernize, the town that depends on it, and it's just a once-in-a-lifetime experience that if you can get into that school, I recommend it to anybody that can afford it. The only way to understand Springbank is that it's Campbelltown's beating heart. If you want to understand it, you just can't look at whiskey. You have to look at the town. Campbelltown is woven into Springbank's DNA, and Springbank is woven into Campbelltown's survival. This isn't just a distillery. It's an economic lifeblood of the place. Springbank malts its own barley, turns it by hand, distills it on site, bottles on site, and maintains traditional maltings. That means it needs people, real people, dozens of them. In the town where the industry has been disappearing for decades, Springbank is the anchor and the anchor employer, keeping families afloat. When I was there, they employed 99 people in that distillery, and then additional people that they helped were local farmers buying the barley, agricultural businesses receiving spent grain and using it as feed for the local farmers, coopers, transporters, tradespeople, tourism through tours, tastings, and the whiskey school. Walk through Campbelltown and you feel it. Springbank isn't just a workplace, it's a lifeline. It didn't take me long to realize that I wasn't in some kind of a tour. What you do at Springbank is you're employed and you participate in every phase of whiskey production, pretty much as it was done over 200 years ago. Only a handful of distilleries still malt even a portion of their own barley by floor malting. Springbank malts all of its barley, 100% by hand, the same way it was done in the 1800s. And when you attend the whiskey school, you don't watch what happens, you become part of it. So we got up the first morning, had breakfast at the B&B that we were staying at, and we walked over to the distillery. The first part of the first day, we hauled barley up to the 3rd floor and dumped it into a massive steeping tank. I don't know the exact dimensions, but it was at least 25 foot long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Then we spread out the barley, and it soaked over several cycles until the moisture content rose from about 12 to 45%. It's kept at 12% so that there's mold and things like that don't grow in it, bacteria, and destroy the barley. It was exhausting work, and this was just the warm-up. This is where the barley wakes up, and it thinks it's being planted. And this is where I woke up and thought, oh shit, this isn't a tour. I'm part of a production team. What did I get myself into? The next step was really spreading the barley out. Once it had soaked and became activated, we had to dig it out of this steeping tank with shovels, put it on the floor, and then the rest of my team, there were 6 of us, we actually put it in wheelbarrows and spread it out over a floor that had low hanging ceilings and to a depth of about 6 inches around this entire floor, which is probably close to the size of half of a football field. The germination process produces heat, and the heat's got to be controlled. If it gets too warm, then the barley doesn't grow. If it gets too cold, then the barley doesn't grow. And what you're growing is that little embryonic plant inside of the seed. If that stalls for any reason, then there's not going to be a conversion of the starches into sugars. So the temperature is controlled by airflow and by turning the grain. Now, what's really going on in that seed is the saccharification. The starches are being converted into simple sugars so that then it can be converted into alcohol by yeast. So part of this process was actually turning the barley, and it's the heart of this whole malting craft. Springbank's maltmen turn the barley every 4 hours, day and night, using wooden shovels. They do have small machines now, but nothing like the large manufacturers. They're just machines that they have to move around the floor in order to turn the barley so it doesn't grow together. So what happens after the barley is completely malted? It's actually at that point in time called green barley or green malt. And what you have to do after that is actually you've got to stop the germination process. Because if germination continues, it will use up not only all the starches, but all the sugars. No sugars, no alcohol. So how do you do that? Well, what we did was in this malting floor, there were huge squares cut out of it that were actually chutes that went down to the kiln. So the way to stop the growth of the embryonic plant is to actually heat the barley so that there's no more growth of these little plants. It kills the embryonic plant. So you have these pushers, they're sort of flat-ended shovels that we shove the malted grain down into the kiln. Now, once that all the grain is down in there, it sort of is in a big pile. And then we had to climb into the kiln, which is basically a square room that has about 6 to 8 feet of barley, and you have to spread the barley flat across the room so when the smoke comes up through the floor, which is just a grate that has openings in it so that the air can come up through the grains to actually heat the grains to kill the embryonic plant. Now, there are really different types of heat, believe it or not. There's the Hazelburn product, which they produce, which has no peat. There's Springbank, which is lightly peated, and there's Long Row whiskeys from the Springbank distillery, and that's heavily peated. So what they do is they light a fire in a stove underneath the kilns, and depending on which recipe they're using, they either include peat into the fire or they put a small amount of peat in there and only let the peat smoke permeate the grains for a shorter period of time, or they include a lot of peat and they keep peating it for the long row. And what that ends up doing, as I said, is it really just kills the embryonic plant and stops the conversion of the sugars that have been formed into energy for the little embryonic plant. The next step in the process that we participated in is the cooling, resting, and milling. And that actually didn't involve as much work for us. The malt actually cools once it's been heated and the embryonic plants have died. It rests in the kiln, and then from the kiln, it's actually moved by conveyors up to the mill. And the mill that they have there is an old original mill that was put in the distillery about over 200 years ago. And the company that actually built these mills was so good at building the mills, they never broke down. And so the companies went out of business. If they need to replace a product that's worn out or broken on the mill, they actually have to have somebody come in and measure it and machine parts for it by hand. What ends up happening before the grain hits the mill is it goes through destoners and magnets. Destoner is basically just a screen that pulls out any stones that may have been present in the grain when it came into the distillery. And they also have magnets, which would grab any screws or anything like that that might have been picked up when they picked the grain in the field. And all of those things are thrown away. And then the mill actually falls down, or the grain actually falls down into the mill where it is milled into a specific size. And they actually have the original boxes that they would actually shake the milled grain through to be sure that it was the right composition. The milled grain is called grits, and each portion of that, the grits itself, the flour, some flour is formed, and then there's the husks from the barley. The only part that's really usable is the grits, and those are then go into the mash and are cooked to start the conversion process of the sugars by yeast into alcohol, heat, and carbon dioxide. So we went actually from the mills. The milled grain goes into large tanks, holding tanks, until they're ready to produce the mash. And what happens is the milled grains are then dropped into by conveyor into what's called a mash tun. At the same time that warm water is dropped in there, and they're mixed very well. It's actually pretty hot water. It's the same thing as cooking, which is done in the United States with corn and the grains that are used to produce bourbon and other U.S. whiskeys. So by the end of the week, we'd seen the entire process. And once the grains have been mashed, they go into a tank called an underback, from which they are pumped up through a heat exchange, which cools the mash and pumps it then into the big washbacks. And the washbacks are where the yeast is added to the mash that's been produced, that's actually been cooled, because if it was too hot or too cold, it would kill the yeast. And during that mashing process, which is long at Springbank, longer than most places, the conversion process occurs from the yeast converting the simple sugars. It's also called saccharification. It converts the simple sugars into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. And when you go in there, the smell is awesome. But if you stick your head down into a wash tub, the smell of alcohol will almost knock you out. So Springbank is a distillery where a lineage like no other is found. It was officially licensed in 1928 and built on the site of Archibald Mitchell's former illicit still. The Mitchell family has been tied to the distillery from the very beginning, and remarkably, that lineage continues today. In 1837, the Reed brothers sold Springbank to John and William Mitchell, the brothers, and then in 1872, John Mitchell bought out his brother and cemented the family's long-term stewardship of the distillery. When the longtime chairman Hedley Wright Mitchell, great-grandson, passed in 2023, ownership was transferred into 3 family trust funds, with a family representative still on the board to maintain continuity. This is one of the last truly family-owned distilleries left in Scotland. There's no conglomerates, no shareholders, and no shortcuts in production. As I mentioned, Springbank is the only distillery in Scotland that performs every single step of whiskey production on site: malting, milling, mashing, fermenting, distilling, aging, and bottling. A few of the highlights, again, are the 100% floor malted barley turned by hand, traditional worm tub condensers, and those are very interesting to see. And what they do is they produce a heavier, oilier spirit. They have a very long fermentation, which I alluded to. The fermentation is 72 to 110 hours. And what that does is it develops deep, fruity esters in their final product that are concentrated during the distillation process. The stills are still direct fire heated. That's very unusual because overheating can result in the production of chemicals that would foul the spirit. So they have to keep very close eye, which we did when we worked in the still house, on the heating and distillation process. And in the bottom of the pot stills at Springbank, there's a copper grate called a rummager, which it actually turns and it scrapes the bottom of the still the entire time that the still is running so that nothing sticks to the bottom of the still and burns, because that would foul the whiskey. So the three types of whiskey that come from Springbank, they're all single malt. There's the Springbank whiskey itself, which is a complex, lightly peated, and they call it 2.5 time distilled. There's the Hazelburn, which is a soft triple distilled product, and that's completely unpeated. And there's Longrow, which is heavily peated, smoky, and it's twice distilled. So Springbank's annual capacity is around 750 liters, which is extremely small, especially given the 99 or so employees that they have. But they've left that intentional so that the product is really a throwback to the 1800s. A little bit about the people that work there, as well as the other students. I mean, I've kept in touch with my 5 classmates. A couple of them I've seen when I've returned to Scotland. Thank goodness for social media, because it's let me stay in touch with basically all the students from my class. And the people at the distillery are just awesome. They're a lot of fun to be with. They love what they do. They're really engaged in working in the distillery and very proud of the work that they do because it's so unique in Scotland. Finally, Campbelltown wasn't just a whiskey town. It is a whiskey town. In the late 1800s, again, they had only 30 active distilleries, but it was considered the richest town per capita in Britain. Steam navigation allowed whiskey to reach Glasgow in just 9 hours, and that fueled the explosive growth of the town. But as always occurs, changes resulted, the railroad line moved in, and it minimized or eliminated the need for steam navigation through the channels to move the whiskey to other sites. What happened to a lot of the distilleries, all those 30 active distilleries, where the quality dropped because they had to drop it in order to try to stay profitable, and then Prohibition hit, so demand went down, the World Wars disrupted trade, and the town's reputation collapsed. The only 2 distilleries that survived was Springbank and Glen Scotia. Glengyle is actually a 3rd distillery, but it's part of the Springbank conglomerate. Then you can see where Campbelltown is on the whiskey map. But in order to be considered a region, a Scotch region in Scotland, it has to have at least 3 distilleries, and so they do meet that criteria. Glengyle, which is another distillery, they produce Kilkerran, but it's also owned and was reopened by the Mitchell family in 2004. They produce Kilkerran, which is known for its lightly peated, oily coastal character, which is sort of that salty character that comes from being on an island. One of the other things that cropped up in Scotland were independent bottlers. And the Springbank Distillery, an organization, has an independent bottler called Cadenheads, which is the oldest independent bottler in Scotland. And it offers single cask releases and blends like Campbelltown Lock. Together, the operations form a small but very significant Campbelltown ecosystem. We actually had our lunches in the Cadenhead facility every day. So we would, work during the morning, go to lunch, and then work during the afternoon in the various parts of the distillery. My favorite part to work in was the warehouse, which we got to sample some very good whiskeys, very old products, 30 plus years old. And we were able to do that as well in the bottling plant, which is just a single line that runs all their products and bottles it. I think we had up to a 28-year-old spring bake while we were there doing the bottling portion. So it surprises people. It surprises the students that you're not just there to watch things. You're not watching stage demonstrations. You're actually doing the real production work. You help with the mashing process, the malting process, fermentation, distillation, filling the casks, moving barrels in and out of warehouses. And then years later, these the products that we put up are going to be sold as either Springbank, Hazelburn, or Longrow. So really, when you're working there, you become part of the distillery's heritage, part of its lineage. And it's just an amazing, amazing experience. So you're not just learning whiskey, you're living it. So Springbank changed me. Springbank's a survivor. It's a family legacy, a community engine, a distillery that refuses to modernize because tradition matters to them. And for me, it was a place where I finally understood what whiskey really is. I understood its heritage. It's not just a drink, not just a product, but a craft, a culture, and even a community. That week became one of the fundamental experiences that eventually led to me starting the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company. Campbelltown may have gone from boom to bust, but Springbank proves that authenticity, tradition, integrity, all of those things still matter. And that's why I keep learning, teaching, and pouring drams that tell a story. So thanks for joining me on this whiskey deep dive. Next time you get a chance to do tasting activity, try using the sheet on my blog to develop a consistent process. When you go in to buy a bottle of whiskey, take a look at the label. You may not understand everything, but if you have questions, you can leave me questions on my website. You can go to the TTB regulations if you want to try to sort that through. I never really wanted to until I started doing blogs and the podcast. But whether as a beginner discovering new flavors or as an aficionado pursuing perfection, the journey always has another fascinating glass to offer. Join us at the Buffalo Distilling Company for a deluxe tour and tasting by signing up on our website, or join me for a whiskey workshop if you're in the Buffalo area. I'd love to have you, and my first one again is on January 17th, 2026, and then once a quarter thereafter. Finally, this podcast provides general information and entertainment. Always drink responsibly and consult local regulations before imbibing. This podcast is meant for listeners who are of legal age, drinking age. I'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, check out my blog, the merchandise, and join me for a workshop or a tasting at the Buffalo Distilling Company. And cheers to bold spirits and curious minds.